From the studios of Farm Journal Broadcast, this is U.S. Farm Report.
Welcome to U.S. Farm Report this weekend, and it's another U.S. Farm Report Beck's College Roadshow, this time from a university that was founded 7 years before where it's housed actually became a state. A university that boasts one of the largest urban campuses in the U.S., stretching along both sides of the Mississippi River, and a university that produced one of agriculture's giants, Mr. Norman Borlaug. We're at the University of Minnesota over the next 60 minutes. More tense words from the Trump administration toward China this week.
Well, I think it's fair to say we're upping the ante here in both directions.
With fresh threats, could the Chinese market be gone for good? The impact it's having on farmers in the upper Midwest and Plains this year. With changing demand, what if you could breed soybeans that boast higher oil content for farmers to cash in?
We'd like to increase the oil content in the soybean up from like 22% up to maybe closer to 30%.
The work being done here at the University of Minnesota. One of the oldest football rivalries in the U.S. happens to call Minnesota home. The story behind that game. And La Nina watch is now in effect. We'll tell you what it means.
The 2025 U.S. Farm Report College Roadshow from the University of Minnesota is brought to you exclusively by Beck's. From farmers' first pass in the field to the final one at harvest, it's a game plan rooted in faith and belief. Beck's Hybrids is with you every turn because both on and off the field, we're all farmers at heart. See why at beckshybrids.com.
And now for the news. While farmers continue to harvest big crops, space for where to store them is at a premium. The soybean harvest has nearly wrapped up in the northwestern corn belt, and with strong yields in China absent from the export market, piles are a common sight at elevators. Without China, some elevators aren't bidding on soybeans, and those that are have lowered their bids.
There's a lot of elevators out there that won't be accepting soybeans. If they do, they're going to be pricing in that risk of not having an export market, specifically China, by pricing it in through the wider basis.
In fact, soybean basis levels are as bad or worse than during the 2018 trade war, as seen in this map, especially in the Northwest Corn Belt, which exports up to 80% of its beans. With the government shutdown, key reports used to gauge how harvest is going are on hold. That's why Farm Journal and our partners at ProFarmer conducted our own survey about harvest yields and other important topics on producers' minds right now. About 1,200 farmers from across the country responded, but we focused mostly on the 7 crop tour states. ProFarmer economist Lane Akery crunched the numbers. The survey shows roughly 79% of the soybean crop has been harvested. The analyst survey this week put progress at 60%. Corn harvest is nearing the halfway point at 43% complete. In terms of yields, Akery pooling expectations compared to last year and plugging it into ProFarmer spreadsheets, estimating a national corn yield average of 178.5 bushels to the acre. That would be lower than last year's estimate of 179.3.
Illinois saw the sharpest decline by far, nearly 7% drop from last year. And, last year was a record Illinois corn crop. And right behind that was Indiana seeing a 4.6% drop. And then Iowa saw a 3.2% drop. So those weighed pretty heavily. And, even Ohio last year, the corn crop was down pretty hard, but it's been dry for most of the year. And on average, we were down 7% in Ohio.
Survey results found higher yield in Minnesota and South Dakota compared to last year, with Nebraska coming in about even. You can read more about this at agweb.com. We continue to follow the latest developments in the trade negotiations between the U.S. and China, and it continues to change. China on Monday calling for the U.S. to withdraw a new threat of high tariffs and other export control measures. The statement from Beijing came after President Trump announced the possible new tariff last week. That's after China placed stricter restrictions on rare earths, a vital resource used in electronics. While the president did not withdraw his tariff threat over the weekend, on his Truth Social site, he posted, quote, "Don't worry about China, it will be fine. Highly respected President Xi just had a bad moment. He doesn't want depression for his country, and neither do I," end quote. And President Trump had something to say this week about China's lack of U.S. soybean buying, posting on his Truth Social site, quote, "I believe that China purposely is not buying our soybeans and causing difficulty for our soybean farmers is an economically hostile act. We are considering terminating business with China having to do with cooking oil and other elements of trade as retribution," end quote. President Trump also talking about soybeans during a bilateral lunch with the president of Argentina.
Yeah, was China trying to draw a wedge between the U.S. and Argentina by buying soybeans from Argentina and not U.S. farmers?
I would say so. Yeah.
And,
Look,
and China on
China likes to draw wedges.
Ships too.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess that's natural. It's China, and it's natural, but it's not gonna mean anything in the end.
The U.S. was China's top market for used cooking oil last year, but after China cut tax rebates late last year and the U.S. imposed tariffs on Chinese goods this year, imports plunged by 65%. President Trump also talking to the media this week from the White House about prices at the grocery store, saying that his administration was working to lower the price of beef in the country.
We are working on beef, and I think we have a deal on beef that's going to bring the price of beef. That would be the one product that we would say is a little bit higher than we want it, maybe higher than we want it, and that's going to be coming down pretty soon too. We did something, we worked our magic.
The president did not elaborate about the deal. Beef prices have climbed to record highs after cattle ranchers were forced to cut herds due to years-long drought in the western U.S. That dried up lands used for grazing and raised feeding costs. A La Nina watch is officially in effect, and meteorologists say this could be one to keep a close eye on. Eric Snodgrass, a principal atmospheric scientist at Nutrien, tells me this winter is shaping up to be cold, snowy in the north, and drier across the south. But Snodgrass says the pattern could dramatically improve drought, shrinking possibly the coverage that's currently setting at 73% of the U.S.
Well, I think if I'm a cotton belt farmer, then I got to be worried because typically, historically, La Ninas tend to favor drier conditions across the southern tier of the United States, from the Sun Belt through the Cotton Belt. Whereas in the Midwestern United States, we tend to do okay. We tend to have good snow. We tend to get decent moisture. So does part of the Pacific Northwest, actually all the way to the Northeast as well. So we tend to split the country north versus south. But the big question I have, Tyne, is what does the drought monitor look like by the time we get into April? Right now, it's at 73% coverage in the lower 48. Is this the kind of winter that can knock this thing back to maybe 33% by the time we get into May of next year?
Snodgrass says it really just depends on what flavor of La Nina we see. He says the jet stream is gaining momentum, and the next few months will be key for moisture recharge heading into 2026. And while he says no 2 years are exactly the same, he actually thinks this winter is shaping up to be similar to last year. All right, that's it for the news. Well, the U.S. was already losing ground in exports to China, but it seems like that accelerated this year. And if you are trying to keep up with the trade tensions right now, it is nearly impossible. We will take a look at the situation with Chip Flory coming up next. Welcome back. Time now for Chip's Corner. Chip Flory joining us. Chip, if you are trying to follow what's happening with the trade tensions with China, it is near impossible. These headlines continue to change, not by the week, not by the day, but by the hour. Hearing about 500% tariffs, 1,000% tariffs, hearing about possible price controls. There is so much going on. If you are a farmer, it is challenging to follow what's happening with policy right now.
Oh, it's challenging for anybody to try to keep up with what is happening with trade policy right now. I think the bottom line is that we're looking at a whole lot of positioning, okay? Posturing by the leaders of China, President Xi, and the United States, President Trump. We had the former ag chief negotiator from the U.S. Trade Reps Office, Greg Dowd, on the show earlier last week. And he reminded us that the plenary meeting of the Chinese Communist Party is coming up next week. So President Xi has to show that he is in charge of the conversation. We've also got the meeting coming up in South Korea at the end of the month. That's where there is still a chance that President Xi and U.S. President Trump could have a face-to-face meeting. Now, Michelle Rook was on for me earlier this week as well. I had a conversation with Tanner Emke from CoBank, and Tanner kind of gave us a little bit of some perspective on just exactly what both sides are trying to accomplish at this point.
We've also had new biofuel policy that has reduced the incentive to use imported feedstocks like used cooking oil. The 45Z tax credit was penalized imports. We had half the RIN value on used cooking oil. So clearly there was already disincentive in place with biofuel policy. So now, what's going to happen if we're going to see further restrictions, of complete ban? That would obviously be beneficial to soybean oil.
So yeah, we have to keep in mind that China's President Xi is doing prep work for these big meetings. And Tanner also warned when we came through the conversation with Tanner. Tanner also warned that any of the positioning that is happening right now should not be taken as long-term policy. None of this has been etched in stone at this point. So, what do we know? Because the temperature is going up on the talks. We know that we can see that President Trump and President Xi are positioning for, I think, what they both assume is going to be kind of a dramatic conclusion to these talks with China, the trade talks. The problem is, I don't think anybody on the ground really knows how it's going to end up here yet, Tyne.
Well, Chip, I can tell you, I did talk to some farmers here in Minnesota while we were here for Roadshow, and patience is wearing thin at this point, to say the least. Patience is wearing thin. All right, Chip Flory, you can catch him twice a day for AgriTalk AM as well as AgriTalk PM. Well, breeding soybeans with higher oil content, that's a focus here at the University of Minnesota, how their work could meet the changing demand. That story is next.
Purchase with a Purpose is brought to you by the Propane Education and Research Council. Receive up to $10,000 toward new propane-powered farm equipment like irrigation engines, power generators, and heating systems when you apply to the Propane Farm Research Program. Get started at propane.com/PFRP.
Soybean growers across the Midwest are always looking for ways to stay one step ahead, whether it's fighting pests, improving yields, or adapting to new market demands. At the University of Minnesota, breeders are working on long-term solutions that could shape the future of soybean farming for decades to come. Breeding better soybeans in the U.S.?
In the front of this demo plot over here, we have varieties that were released back in the 1940s, 1950s.
Has come a long way.
These are the varieties that farmers grew, 70 or so years ago. You can see that they're falling down. They don't have very many pods on them. They're very tall and lanky, not very good agronomically.
Aaron Lorenz has called the University of Minnesota home for the past decade, and he says the soybeans of today are much more resilient. There's been a lot of changes since the 1940s, but what do you think is the biggest benefit we have seen when it comes to breeding in that time?
That's a good question. I mean, I think yield. I mean, on average, breeders have increased yield by about a half to a bushel per year. So right now, the varieties that farmers are growing on the landscape yield about 2.5 times more than the varieties that their predecessors grew back in the 1940s and 1950s.
Growing bigger bushels is often the end game for farmers, but in order to do that, breeders are also uncovering ways to protect farmers against the pests and pressures that rob yield. One of the biggest problems they're tackling, soybean cyst nematode, a pest that's evolving to overcome the defenses farmers have relied on for decades.
I would say that the things that continually come up would be, of course, soybean cyst nematode is number one. The main thing about soybean cyst nematode that's of concern to farmers is that the current resistance that most Minnesota farmers use comes from one single source that researchers discovered 40, 50 years ago, and has basically been in elite varieties for 40 or so years. So since it's been used so long and so often, there's been a resistance breakdown that occurs on the landscape out there. Basically, the soybean cyst nematodes on the landscape are evolving to overcome our current source of resistance.
So with soybean cyst nematode, do farmers typically know that they have resistance in their fields?
They may or may not. So the thing about soybean cyst nematode is that because the populations of nematodes out there in the landscape are evolving over time and changing and overcoming current sources of resistance, a farmer may plant a resistant variety thinking they have protection and resistance. But if the population in their field has changed to overcome that source of resistance, they may be losing yield and not even know it. So that's good. It's good to get a good soil test, rotate your sources of resistance to see if you get a yield benefit from a different source of resistance.
So growers can be losing yield and not know that it's actually from soybean cyst nematode sometimes.
That's right. Especially if they have resistance, the population in the field has overcome that resistance, they may not know it unless you do a soil test.
As a way to combat that resistance, Lorenz and his team are breeding with new sources of resistance, making sure the next generation of varieties is ready before today's tools stop working on farms.
We're working on, with some projects with Minnesota Soybean and the United Soybean Board, we're working on not just discovering those new sources of resistance. We are doing some of that in collaboration with a colleague, Senyu Chen in Waseca, Minnesota. We're doing some of that, but we're also mostly breeding with different sources of resistance to get those genes that we know have good resistance for new SCN populations on the landscape into elite varieties that farmers may want to grow.
But breeding isn't just about finding pests and boosting yield. The program is also working to meet the possibility of new soybean demand with renewable diesel.
We understand that there's a lot of potential future demand out there for renewable diesel, which is going to require a lot more oil. And we'd like to increase the oil content in the soybean up from like 22% up to maybe closer to 30% to make it more of a higher oil crop and make it more valuable from that standpoint.
That work started after Minnesota Soybean Growers Association came to the university with a challenge: find a way to breed soybeans to meet the growing need.
We work very closely with those growers groups to identify target traits that we should be working on, because they have, they have their ears closer to the ground. They know what's out there. They can see the industry as a whole better than we can, and help direct us in terms of our research demand. So that's been a very fruitful collaboration.
From the possibility of a soybean that looks more like canola to other varieties that boast more oil than what soybean farmers are growing today, this public soybean breeding program spans across the state. And it's this research from field to farm that has a goal of meeting the demands of farmers and consumers down the road. Well, what is it like to grow crops without soil? We take a look at that research from the University of Minnesota next. Well, the way food is growing is changing, whether it's from labor constraints or increased water regulations out west. It's a catalyst creating that change. Here at the University of Minnesota, researchers are experimenting with new technology to help growers use less water and produce more food, but all indoors. And it's opening a new field of opportunity. Bright lights, rows of kale, lettuce, and dwarf tomatoes that fill the room. There's something missing in most of this greenhouse, and that's soil.
One of the major factors that we have going on is hydroponics here. Hydroponics is literally water working. In Greek, that's what it means, working with water. And so a lot of our plants here, if I were to pull these out, there is not a soil substrate in there. It is pretty much just roots hanging out in water.
Assistant Professor Nate Ahlens focuses on controlled environment agriculture, or CEA. Here, plants grow in a hydroponic system that recirculates water, sloping gently to drain and pump back again. A closed-loop system that saves both water and nutrients. What is the benefit of growing these plants in water versus soil?
Right. So having this recirculating system is probably that primary benefit. We're able to use about 9 to 10% of the water that you would for growing these per kilogram basis, per biomass basis. This 9 to 10% of that water that you'd use out in the field.
Just because it's recirculating?
Just because it's recirculating. We're not having any runoff. Any of our nutrients aren't leaching out into the environment, into our waterways. So by recirculating, we're only providing, and the plants are only taking what they need at that very moment.
But saving water is just the start. Ahlen's team is experimenting with quantum dots. Those are microscopic particles that transform light to make plants grow faster.
Quantum dots are little nanoparticles, and they absorb photons of light and change that photon into a different photon. So say you have blue light coming in, it might be red light coming out of it. So what we're doing is taking a liquid quantum dot and we're spraying it on some of these plants. You can't tell which ones of them have it. And then on the leaf surface, they are absorbing that photon, say a blue photon, and converting it to a red photon. And that might speed up the process of photosynthesis at different stages of the plant growth.
By altering the light spectrum, researchers hope to speed the flowering on these plants, which will then boost yields and ultimately make indoor production more efficient.
What we're trying to find out is, can we get to an earlier flowering time? Can we get more fruit out of an individual plant? Can we speed up the vegetative cycle? Can we do any of these phenology benefits that help growers out in an economical way that leads to profitability?
His larger mission is clear: make controlled environment agriculture more profitable for commercial growers and squash the misconception that growing produce indoors doesn't pencil.
Ultimately, it's about profitability. We run into a problem of profitability. The economic model always has to work out. We pay for lights, we pay for infrastructure, all this equipment around us. That capital cost is pretty expensive. So what I want to see is more productivity out of these plants so that when we look at production costs, overall they come down for growers.
From light bending nanoparticles to water saving hydroponics, the work here at the University of Minnesota could reshape how America's produce is grown and take profitability for those growers to new heights. Aylin told me right now it's cheaper to grow produce in the field, but it's this type of work that could possibly change that in the future. Well, when we come back, tensions between the U.S. and China, we've talked about it. They heated up this week. Could that market be gone for good? Our marketing discussion happens from right here at the University of Minnesota next.
You're watching U.S. Farm Report. Trusted, timely, tradition. The 2025 U.S. Farm Report College Roadshow from the University of Minnesota is brought to you exclusively by Beck's. From farmers' first pass in the field to the final one at harvest, it's a game plan rooted in faith and belief. Beck's Hybrids is with you every turn because both on and off the field, we're all farmers at heart. See why at beckshybrids.com.
Welcome back to the University of Minnesota for our College Roadshow here in Minneapolis. Excited for our conversation today with Ed Ussett, Pauline Van Erden, as well as Brian Bohr to talk about, navigate some of these challenges that we're having right now. Ed, there's a lot of things to talk about when it comes to policy-wise, but let's start with just we keep hearing about these piles of soybeans. I think the governor here said, we're going to have so many soybeans, nowhere to take them, that we're going to put them in garages. I mean, so much now, but as you see what it's actually happening now that we're in harvest, what have we seen happen with basis, and what are the cash prices that farmers are seeing here?
Well, I'm kind of surprised. A couple of weeks ago, I really was concerned that we wouldn't find a home for all the soybeans, but I'm talking to people in the country. They found a place for them. They're in storage. They're holding out. Prices are not good. Probably $9.25 a bushel in much of southern Minnesota, somewhere in that area. But we found room for the soybeans. The problem, I think, is going to be in the next couple of weeks because a lot of space was dedicated to soybeans. Where does the corn go? We're going to have corn piles.
Yeah, so what type of yields are we talking? We heard some promising expectations on Crop Tour this year. We found really solid yields in southern Minnesota. What are we seeing now that harvest is going on?
I think we're seeing good yields in soybeans. I think there's a good chance in Minnesota we'll set a state record for average soybean yields. Not by a lot, 52 bushels is our record. I like to think we have a shot at 53 for a state average. Corn yields, we have an outside shot to top 200 bushels an acre for a state.
Well, and when you look at prices today, in some cases a little bit higher than we saw at this time last year, but still those yields are going to help. And so, Pauline, when you look at last year, Minnesota farmers saw the lowest farm income in 20 years. What's your expectation now that yields are coming in? We know input costs. What's your expectation for 2025?
Unfortunately for crop farmers, that looks like more of the same, low prices, even with the better yields, but input costs are up. Certainly the ECAP payment that was received earlier this year was helpful. That provided some cash. We actually included that income in last year's numbers, though, on the balance sheet as an accounts receivable. So it looks to be another challenging year with crop producers having, losses per acre on corn and soybean production.
Yeah, and we've been, following kind of the updates from the Trump administration on these possible farmer aid payments and when those could come, delayed because of the government shutdown, but still waiting on details from that. I mean, but when you look at the balance sheet today, are more payments needed for agriculture?
Well, something's needed. I know farmers would rather be able to sell their crop at a profitable price and not receive payments, of course. Payments are a Band-Aid. Hopefully we can find new solutions to help replace markets, find new markets, all of that. But, payments would be helpful at this challenging time.
Yeah, there are challenges. I mean, we talked about it with Ed. We talked about it with Pauline. So Brian, what are the main challenges that you're hearing, that you're seeing, that you're really trying to prepare this next generation for?
Well, that's a great question. So, and I think it's that thing right now, we're seeing these challenging times. And I think it's this question as you look at education, the students here, for example, there are enormous opportunities out there in innovation and so on going on. And so these periods of, I came through a cycle of the 1980s that had some of these challenges emerging here. Certainly with trade was part of that as well. So to not lose sight of the fact that in agriculture, the opportunities to work in agriculture is going to be there. And thinking about that long run, I think for farmers too now, it's that piece where we have these cyclical phenomena that occur. what are those long-term opportunities? And certainly when we think about, careers in, for example, grain merchandising, since we're talking about that here, are there, but the agronomic side of this and looking at precision agriculture, data sciences, some of the new fields that are emerging, AI is going to be a part of these students' careers, and thinking about how do we adapt and help farmers adjust to rapidly changing conditions with really excellent information on both agronomic, on marketing side, and that opportunities are all going to be there in the future for students coming out there, because we need food, right? So it will be there. It's how do we weather some of these challenges that we're talking about here through time.
Yeah, and these challenges continue to evolve. I mean, right now, Ed, the main challenge for soybean farmers, of course, is China. The Trump administration saying this week that the soybean, that China is intentionally not buying U.S. soybeans. I don't think that comes as a shock to any of us. We've been talking about that for a while. They've been told not to buy U.S. soybeans. But do you think that business is lost for good, Ed?
Oh boy, that's a tough question. We had a trade war in 2018-19. Got by it, got a change in administration, and we got the sales back. I guess if I want to be hopeful, we can hope it comes back again.
Yeah, Pauline, I mean, how many more bushels are we talking that growers will have to produce next year to cover some of these added expenses? I know that's something that you focus on.
Talking to some producers this morning, hearing numbers of 70 more bushels on corn just to cover some of the increased fertilizer costs. So that's not easy to do, maybe not even possible to do. So there's certainly, it is a challenging environment, challenging financial environment right now, for sure.
Brian, when you look at the University of Minnesota Extension and some of those efforts that we're talking about, how is that helping farmers today?
That's a great question. One thing, Pauline, I was thinking about when you were saying that is it's going to be a lot of capital management, just for example now, and thinking about those short-term loans, long-term loans, the capital. The good news for agriculture is we're in a very different spot than we were in, say, the late 70s, early 80s, where farms have good capital investment. So there's those opportunities that's going to be a really key managerial piece, I think, going forward. To the question about what the University of Minnesota Extension is doing, we always encourage this point because there's going to be stress out there in farm country. There's programs within Extension, and the key thing is to reach out to support systems, right? Reach out. We have farmer lender mediation, for example, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. That's an opportunity to work between lenders and farmers as they're managing some of those capital things. Certainly there's, we think about farm safety now. We're still in the harvest seasons. We're still in that stage. And what happens is people are stressed. They're moving through those safety programs about just day-to-day things of taking care of the priority, which is your family, your people, your workers managing those farms. And that's all part of our extension effort across the state.
Pauline, you're talking to a lot of farmers right now. Real quick, wrap us up. What do you want farmers to know?
Good question. Take a look and push the pencil to your finances. Talk to your lender. Build that support, like Brian said. Reach out if you need help. There's great collaboration between the university and the state of Minnesota with some of those programs. But there are resources out there to help. So always seek out the tools or the individuals that can help you.
Ed, real quick, what are you telling farmers?
Look at the big carries in the market. Today's price is really terrible. You look at today's prices, pretty much as low as they've been in the last year. But in the corn market, for example, if you looked for delivery in April or May, you've got a 35 to 40 cent premium. You've got a 50-cent premium to hang on to your soybeans out into the spring. I don't know if that solves all the problems, but it's a hell of a lot better than today's price. In addition, no one wants to talk about spring wheat. I like spring wheat. Up in the northwest part of the country, if you'll hold out to January, you can get a 50-cent premium for wheat. 50 cents for 3 months. That's how big the carry is.
Pauline, Brian, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. We need to take a quick break, and then we'll be back with more U.S. Farm Report. Consumers are demanding more from the dairy products they already eat. More protein, more function, and more innovation. At the University of Minnesota, researchers are working to meet those changing needs, all while helping farmers and processors keep pace with an ever-evolving market.
We've got ice cream mix going into the freezer, The refrigeration just kicked in, so we're gonna start hardening out the ice cream.
Step into this pilot plant.
We'll send it through the rest of the system to get the fruit, the raisin pieces on this flavor added, and then we'll be able to start filling packaging.
And you're stepping into a bit of history. This pilot plant was originally built 66 years ago. What was once a pilot plant just for research and dairy product production soon became home to food and nutrition as well. But even 6 decades later.
What kind of ice cream are you making right now?
So it's rum raisin ice cream.
These researchers are constantly churning out something new.
I've never heard of rum raisin ice cream. Is this new?
It's not something we've had very much. I mean, you can find it online, but I haven't seen it much in the store. So it was a new, we did a bunch of flavor screening a few months back and did some little test batches in the lab, and from the grad students and people who came through, it was a love it or hate it flavor, so we went with it.
The dairy aisle is definitely changing for more than just ice cream. From high-protein yogurts to fortified beverages, today's consumers want products that are packed with more nutrition without sacrificing taste. And at the University of Minnesota, researchers are working to make that possible, helping the dairy industry keep pace with shifting demands.
The focus of my research is always driven by the industry input. Through our Midwest Dairy Food Research Center, and we meet twice a year to brainstorm what are the industry research needs and come up with top priorities. What does industry needs right now? So as you said, one of the top priority right now is how can we incorporate more protein in products and low carbohydrates.
A three-way partnership between the dairy industry, dairy farmers through Midwest Dairy, as well as the Dairy Checkoff. The Midwest Dairy Research Center also taps into the brainpower from 6 different universities across the Midwest. And for Dr. Jayendra Amamcherla, his work focuses on fractionating milk using membrane technology to separate ingredients that can be used in products like protein-packed drinks and yogurt.
There are several challenges that comes with increasing the protein content in a given product. Mostly there are 2 things that could happen in a high protein beverage. That is either sedimentation or agelation. Over time, these proteins settle down to the bottom and at some point they gel, and it is not acceptable by the consumers. So we come up with technologies to make sure these proteins stay in solution throughout the shelf life.
He says the goal is to make sure the protein beverage that has to be processed is not only nutritious, but stable enough to maintain a strong shelf life that consumers want.
But this is what the industry is demanding, right?
Yes. I think going forward, this trend is going to be there with GLP-1 drug that is getting popular. High protein, low carb products are going to be in the market in the next foreseeable future.
The state of Minnesota and the university's Board of Regents also see a future in what's being done here. Both recently committed a total of $55 million to cover the costs of pilot plant project upgrades. It's another big investment into innovation that could fuel the dairy industry in the years to come.
Whatever we do, dairy farmers are members of the center. They are in the advisory council, and they are informed about what we are doing and make sure the research that we are doing is relevant for the dairy industry.
As consumer preferences evolve and high-protein, low-carb products dominate grocery shelves, the University of Minnesota's work is helping farmers and processors adapt, innovate, and thrive in a rapidly changing dairy landscape.
Well, it's one of the oldest football rivalries in college football. For decades, Minnesota and Iowa have battled it out for bragging rights in the upper Midwest. But what's the story behind the rivalry? Well, it's intense, as Andrew McCrae shows us next.
Watch Markets Now with Michelle Rook on the Farm Journal YouTube channel, keeping you updated throughout the day on the markets at the open, midday, and close. Find out what moved the markets today and what to expect the market to do next.
Well, you don't dare say Iowa around here. That's because the Iowa versus Minnesota football rivalry is one of the oldest and most unique in college football, and it carries a deeper historical meaning than just a game. Andrew McCrae travels the countryside to find out why the outcome of a 1934 matchup between the two teams is still shaping the rivalry today.
The universities of Iowa and Minnesota have played a football game against each other over 100 times.
One game in the 1930s still impacts the rivalry today.
It was in 1934, and actually that game was broadcast by former President Ronald Reagan on WHO. Iowa had a running back by the name of Ozzie Simmons, who was touted by Ronald Reagan as the best running back he'd ever seen.
David Flattery says not only was Simmons a gifted halfback, he was also African American, and that could make him a target for some teams in the segregation era. That's what happened on October 28, 1934 in Iowa City.
Well, let's just put it this way, they mistreated him. And the governor at the time was a guy by the name of Clyde Herring, and he was not happy with the mistreatment that Ozzie received during that football game.
Iowa Governor Herring remembered the treatment Simmons had received in 1934. Before the 1935 contest, he told reporters that if Minnesota treated Simmons the same way they had last year, the crowd would come out of the stands and take matters into their own hands. Minnesota's governor, Floyd Olson, helped defuse the situation by stating the governors could wager a prize-winning pig on the outcome of the game. Governor Herring accepted the offer.
Iowa got beat by Minnesota, and so there was a resident that owned the Rosedale farm here where we stand. His name was Al Loomis, and he was politically connected. And he had a prize hog that was the brother to Blue Boy.
Blue Boy was the champion hog that appeared in the 1933 movie State Fair, which featured Roy Rogers. So the brother of Blue Boy was to be given to the Minnesota governor to make good on the wager.
They decided, let's take this pig and we'll walk it up to the State House in Minnesota, and they named him Floyd after Floyd B. Olson, the governor of Minnesota, and the Rosedale farm. So hence we've got Floyd of Rosedale as the name of the pig.
Minnesota Governor Floyd accepted the hog, and perhaps the two governors thought they would just wager the same live pig on future games. But when the hog died a few months later, they decided to fashion a trophy in the likeness of Floyd of Rosedale. It's the trophy that is still given to the champion of that game every year. Dave grew up in the area and wanted to keep the story of the farm, the hog, and that game from 1934 alive for people to see.
I felt it was important to create this statue here as a legacy for that story, so that story never dies. And so as you see the plaque over here and everything else, it tells the story of Floyd of Rosedale.
While Rosedale Farm has been gone for decades, the story of Floyd is very much alive, with two state universities competing for Floyd's trophy every football season. Traveling the countryside in Fort Dodge, Iowa, I'm Andrew McCrae.
Thanks, Andrew. Well, the next Iowa versus Minnesota football game, well, that's coming up next weekend, October 25th in Iowa City. We need to take a quick break, then we're checking in with Minnesota's own Machinery Pete. Tractor Tales is next.
Purchase with a Purpose is brought to you by the Propane Education and Research Council. Receive up to $10,000 toward new propane-powered farm equipment like irrigation engines, power generators, and heating systems when you apply to the Propane Farm Research Program. Get started at propane.com/PFRP.
Be sure to check out the Moving Iron podcast with Casey Seymour and Machinery Pete, with new episodes released every Thursday. You can find Moving Iron on all the popular podcast platforms, plus agweb.com and Farm Journal's YouTube channel.
Hey, welcome back to Tractor Tales, folks. This week, a special treat for you from my home state of Minnesota. My friend Danny Anderson and his special International 1086 and 806.
Serial number 8602. So this tractor here would be the second one that was built. The 1086 over there, that one's pretty loaded up. It's got, you know, the bigger front rubber 1116. It's got 20.838 rears. It's got the heavy duty 3-point hitch. Got 3 remotes on it. Has a hydraulic seat in it. Pretty amazing that I would end up with 2 of 1 and 2. That just doesn't happen, you know. Very unique tractors. I used both of them. Hauled corn to town and beans with them both last fall, and kind of fun to get to use them. And these tractors would have been used at Hinsdale Engineering, you know, back in the day, and at the photo farm at Hickory Hills. They would have went around to the farm shows and stuff like that for the introduction of the 86 series tractors, and would have been used in the still photos for the brochures, service manuals, that type of thing. And then when they were done with these tractors, just like the 1206s, then they went back to Hinsdale, and then Hinsdale sold them off, and the dealership could buy them and then resell them to the public. That's how the tractors ended up out in the country. The 886 had its hands full this fall when I was hauling 650 bushels of corn to town with 2 wagons behind it. It was a bit of a load for an 80-some horsepower tractor. That tractor's pretty loaded up for back in the day. Most 1086s all come with 18-438s and 1016 fronts, and they wouldn't have had the heavy-duty 3-point. Most of the tractors all had 2 remotes on them. These tractors, obviously, this one, when I got it, I looked at the hours on it, and that 1086 came from northeast Iowa, just north of the Quad Cities is where that tractor, so it didn't make it very far from the farmall plant, but these 2 tractors have within 100 hours of each other on them. They're right around 6,000 hours on them. So.
Well, that does it for our U.S. Farm Report Beck's College Roadshow from here in Minnesota. The fall color of the trees are starting to peak. Beautiful backdrop for our show this weekend. Next weekend, we are actually taking a break from the road. We are back in the studio, and we hope you join us as we work to build on our tradition. Have a great weekend, everyone.
U.S. Farm Report is produced and distributed by Farm Journal Broadcast.